If you want to learn how to build a dynamic web app using only C# with no JavaScript, then you have come to the right place. Hello, my name is Alexander and I will learn you how to get started with Blazor. But before we can begin coding, we just need to have a good understanding of what Blazor actually is and how it works under the hood. So as you might know from JavaScript, you can use it directly in the browser without any server listening to it. You can also use AJAX calls to fetch data from the database without having to reload the page. When doing an AJAX call, JavaScript will handle the response and just reorder the DOM for you when you do something like document, get element by ID, and change the inner HTML. However, we have to throw that idea away now, because now Blazor will handle it all for us, and it's all just by using C#. And this can be done because the browser now supports almost native C#. But what do I mean with almost native C#? To answer that, we need to go back to 2019, where W3C, which is the World Wide Web Consortium, made it possible to use a fourth language in the browser. So now, beside HTML, CSS and JavaScript, we are now able to use what's called WebAssembly. And by adding that fourth language, we do now have a low-level programming language that we can compile to. WebAssembly simply enables us to take our application and make it binary, so WebAssembly can display it in the browser. And we really don't have to understand it because it's all under the hood of Blazor. And that's also why WebAssembly is out of the scope for this video, because it's a whole topic for itself. We just need to know that WebAssembly is the reason that we can use Blazor in the first place. To be able to follow along in this video, you need to have just a bit of understanding of how ASP.NET Core works, or at least just some experience with C#. But when saying that, you don't have to be scared away. Maybe if you have experience from another programming language, then you might be good. In this video, I will use .NET 6 inside Visual Studio 2022, the Community Edition. So if you want to follow along, then you have to install these. I will put link in the description below. It should not take a long time to install, depending on your computer, of course. But for now, let's go and open Visual Studio and let's create a new project. So now I have Visual Studio 2022 open and I want to go and create a new project. And inside this window, I want to choose Blazor WebAssembly app. And if you cannot find it, you can go up and search for a template. And let's just type Blazor. And there it comes. Blazor WebAssembly web app. But if you don't get it in the results here, then don't worry, I will show you in just a moment how you will get it. But for now, I will just hit next and we will give the project a name, and let's say my first Blazor project, and just hit next. And inside this window we have the framework we need to choose, and I will just choose the .NET 6 framework. So for you to follow along and don't get any weird errors, I will recommend that you also use .NET 6. And we don't want to have any authentication type. It's okay to configure the HTTPS. And we don't want to use ASP.NET Core hosted. And we don't want to use this progressive web application. So now we just hit create. If you didn't got the Blazor WebAssembly app showing in the projects, then just go and open a normal ASP.NET Core project or whatever you want to open. Just so you come into this window where you can click on Tools and say Get Tools and Features. And inside the Tools and Features, you will enable the ASP.NET and web development. And you also want to enable the .NET Desktop development. When you have done that, you should be able to select the Blazor WebAssembly app and come to this step where we close this and we run the application to see what is already created for us. So let's hit the Run Application button. When running the project, we get this default web page where we have a home button which is this page. We have a counter where we can click a button and it will count up, and it's all by using C#. And at last we have this fetch data, where it simulates that it has some data that it fetched from another place. But right now it's actually just some static data that is hard-coded in the project. But to start with, let's go and close this and let's see how the counter works inside the code. So let's just close this. And as you can see on the right side here, we have the Solution Explorer, where the most important things right now is under the pages. And as you can see, we have a counter.razor page, we have a fetchData.razor, and we have a index.razor. And that's actually all the pages that we just looked at. And if you're wondering where the menu is, because this is just the pages that we show, then it's under this shared folder, where we have the main layout and we have the navigation menu. So just like ASP.NET Core, we have a shared folder with all the pages or all the stuff that we want to have on multiple pages, just like the main layout. If we go into the main layout, you can actually see that we have a body. So again, it's actually just like ASP.NET Core, that when a page is loading, it will just load the main layout file every time a new page is loaded. If we look at the top of this file, we have the sidebar, where we include the nav menu, and this is one of the powerful things in Blazor, that we can just say nav menu, then it will know that it is the nav menu.razor file that we want to include, because it has the same name. But let's go and try to look at the counter. So let's open the counter.razor file. And inside here we can see the magic, where we only have to use C# to actually increment the number or the counter just by clicking a button. So as you can see here, first we say that this should be the URL and this is a page. So this is going to be the route to this page. Then we include a page title, a h1 tag, and then we display the actual counter right here. And then the increment button down here. So this is pretty standard way to do it, that we have all the HTML and markup right here. And down under we have the code behind, which is now not in its own code behind file, but it is just included in our Razor page. But the way all this works is that we first have to make a property where we start to say that the current count should be equal to 0. And then every time we hit this method called increment count, it will count up by 1. And the way we trigger this method is just by saying on click on the button and then just called what the method is called. So before Blazor, what we would have to do was to, in JavaScript, go and create a on click button just like we do right here, and then just run a function in JavaScript where we also would have a property or just a variable like this. But instead of just counting it up, we would have to count it up and then add it to the DOM by saying document.getElementById.innerHTML and set that equal to the current count. But what you could do now was just to play around with this page a bit. Like I will try to increase this not just with 1, but maybe with 10 instead of 1. So let's go and say it should be equal to the current count plus 10. And let's run this application. And let's go to the counter page and click me. And now you can see it will increment by 10 every time we click the button. But let's try to go back to the home page. And as you can see now, we have a headline and we have some paragraph and we have a box with some text in it. But let's try to include the counter inside our home page. And the way we do that is to go to our index page, index.razor file. And just like we saw with the nav menu inside our layouts file, we can just include the counter right here and say counter and close it. Not like this, but like this. And let's try to run this. And now you can see that we included the counter on the front page. So if we click me, you can see that it still works. And if we click on the counter, it would also be here. So Blazor is making it very simple to include small elements with all the functionality that you already made, just where you want it to be. But now let's say that we don't want to have this counter to count the same interval as the counter on the counter page. So what I mean by that is when we click this, we just want this to be increasing by 1, and this should be increasing by 10. So let's go back to the code, and instead of writing 10 here, we will make a new variable called interval, and then we want to create this variable up here like a new property, and we call it public, and it should be an integer, and we call it interval. And let's just say that the default interval should be 1, and then let's put a data annotation called parameter. And actually for this to work, we have to include the get and set method in here, like this. And then what we can do now is actually when we call the counter on our front page, we can actually write interval and set it to, let's say, 10. So whenever the counter is called from the front page now, the interval will be 10. Or else if we delete this, it would be the default value that was 1. And what we have to remember here is that when we want to use this type of parameter, we need to specify this data annotation parameter above our property that we want to have to be a parameter. But now let's go and try and test this. So let's run the application. Then let's go and try to click on the click me button. And as you can see, it increments by 10 every time we click it. And when we go to the counters page, it will increment by 1. So it's actually a pretty powerful way to manipulate or insert any parameter you want on any pages that you want by actually reusing the code that you have already done. But now let's go and take a look at the fetch data page. And as you can see, we already have a lot of data that is displayed nice in this table. But as I mentioned earlier, this data is actually just hard-coded. And what I mean by that is that it's not fetched from an actual database, it's fetched from a JSON file. So what we will do now is to actually see the code behind this table. And then we will do so this is not just fetched from a static JSON file, but from an actual database. So let's close this and go to the pages folder where we have our fetch data.razor page. And just like the counter page, we define what the URL of this page is on the top. But a new thing on this page is that we dependency inject our HTTP client so that we can use it in the code down here. And then we have our actual markup right here in HTML. And then we have the code behind down here. And the way this page and the counter page and the index page is built up is the general way that we will build up a page in Blazor. So it will be good to get used to it, but it's of course also very simple, so I don't think that would be a problem. But if we look at the HTML, then we can see that we again have a page title, we have a H1 headline, we have a paragraph, and then we have a forecast variable where when it says that when it's null, then it will just show that something is loading, but else it will display the forecast. So the first thing it do is that it creates a table for us with a lot of headings in the table, and then we for each every row element in the forecast array that we get here. You could also just make a list, but it's just what you prefer. But as we can see down in the code right here, they're going to make an array that's named forecast. And a new thing, I will just zoom in a little bit, but the new thing is that we don't say on get async anymore. We say on initialized async now. So when the page is loaded, we will run this method instead of an onGet method. And because this is run async, we can do this with the forecast where we say when it's equal to null, it's loading, because then it has no value yet. And then when it gets value, it will automatically say that this is not null anymore, and then it will display this instead. So that actually also shows how powerful Blazor is now. But when this page is loading, what we are going to say is that it will make a HTTP client request where we say we get from JSON async. So it expects some kind of JSON, and we can do it async because the method is also async, and it's just returning a task. And then we say that the object that it want to have in return is the weather forecast, and it should be an array of them. And then it looks into this file. And of course we can take this file and just replace it with a URL. So first of all, we have to install a SQL server on our computer, and I will just install the SQL server from Microsoft. I will put this link in the description, and then I want to scroll down and download this Express edition. So I say download now. I don't have this installed on my PC. And I will just make a basic installation, and we will accept the terms. Then we want to say install, and just take the time it will take. So now that the SQL Server 2029 Express Edition is installed, I also want to install SSMS so that we actually can see inside the database, because this is just the server. So we have no access to look into the database without actually making some code that would look into the connection string here. So let's click install SSMS. Then we get to this Microsoft page where we want to scroll a bit down and click this free download for SQL Server Management Studio. And now when the download is complete, I will click it. Then we want to hit install. And when it's done, we just hit close. And now if you hit your Windows key and type SSMS, you can see that we have Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio 18. So let's open that. And when you open the Server Management Studio, you get this pop-up box where you just want to hit connect. So now as you can see here in our Object Explorer, we have databases, and then we have system databases where we have our actual databases right now. And we're just going to use the master database. So if we expand that, we can see that it has some tables. So let's go and right click the tables folder, and we hit new and table. So this will create a new table for us. And then we want to go back to Visual Studio to see how the model looks. So we have a date, a temperature in Celsius, and we have a summary, and then a temperature in Fahrenheit. So let's go back and we will say date, and this is a date time. Then we had temperature in Celsius, which was a int. Then we had a summary, and that will be a nchar. That's fine, and let's say 100 characters. And then we had the temperature in Fahrenheit, which was also a integer. So next we will right click and say properties, so that we can change the name of the table, and in our case it would be weather forecast. And then we want to go and click this save icon, so we save the weather forecast table, and let's update the Explorer. And then we can see down here that we have the weather forecast table. So if we right click and say select top 1000 rows, we can see that we have our table here with all our columns. So now we just want to put some data inside it, and the way we do that is to go to new query, and I will just copy and paste some code I have that you can also copy and paste by going to my blog in the link in the description. And this is the code, and what it will do is that it will just insert 6 rows into our weather forecast, and it's actually just the same data that was being used inside our Blazor template. but just with another additional row right here where I say this is from our own database. And that's just so we can see that the data is actually coming from the database and not the JSON file. But to actually insert the rows, we have to say execute. And now you can see that 6 rows has been affected. So if we go back to this top 1000 rows and say execute again, we can now see that we have all our 6 rows. So now we have to go back to our code to connect to this SQL database. And because this is MS SQL, so Microsoft's own database system, it is very easy to connect to the .NET framework. So let's minimize this one. And let's just close our application and also close this one. And we will go to the program.cs file. So to do it the easy way, we want to scaffold all the code into our project. And the way we can do that is by using Entity Framework. So we will have to install that. So let's go to Tools and to NuGet Package Manager. And inside this Manage NuGet Package for Solution, then we get this window, and then we want to browse and then type Microsoft Entity Framework SQL Server, and that's the first one we want to install. So if I just scroll up, it will be right here, and then I will just select the project we want to install it to. It is my first Blazor project, and then install, accepting the license, and then it's installed. And the next thing we want to install is not the SQL Server, but it's the tools. So it's this one, and again we just want to install it and accept the license. Then down here at the bottom of Visual Studio, we want to open the Package Manager console, and then we want to type Scaffold, the dbcontext, and then our connection string that we will actually get from the installation of the Express edition of the SQL Server. So as you can see here, the top string here is the connection string. And don't worry if you don't have it, you can also just copy and paste this from my blog. And actually you can I will just put this inside my blog so you can go and grab this. Because after we say that we want to use this connection string, we are saying that we also want to use SQL Server, the Entity Framework core package that we just downloaded. And what we want to output is a folder called DataDB. And inside this DataDB, we will have our context file. So I'll just hit enter, and I actually got an error right here, but I think I know why. So I think maybe the problem is in the connection string. If we hit up again, and we say this localhost should not be localhost, but our name of our desktop, where if you right click and say properties, you can just go and copy and paste it from this field. So let's close this again. And let's try this one out. And we actually get this same error. So there must be something very essential that I didn't do so this would work. So I'll just pause the video and then I will try to figure out why this is happening. And then I will come back with an answer. So I did a lot of research on this error, and it really looks like that Microsoft don't even know why this is happening. And it even happened in Visual Studio 2019, and there's still no fix for it. The only fix that we can do is to go and create a new project, because then it will not happen. It is something with this project that has gone wrong. And on Stack Overflow and other forums, there's really no solution to this problem other than if you have made some pages, then you have to copy and paste it into a new project. So I think that's just what we're going to do. Lucky for us that we haven't even made some coding inside the project. So we can actually just go and create a new project, and let's try to call it the same. So we will say create new project. And it's a Blazor. And now when I'm in here, I actually know what the problem was. It was that we was using a Blazor WebAssembly app that we should not use. We should use the Blazor server app instead, because the Blazor WebAssembly app is for offline apps and Blazor server apps is for having a server that actually can connect to the internet. So I apologize the struggle with this issue, but hopefully we learned something both. That it's very important to use the Blazor server app instead. So let's choose that and say next. And let's call the application for my first Blazor project. And let's call it 2 because we already have a first edition. So let's say next. And inside here it's okay. So let's just hit create. And now that the project is created, I will go and install the NuGet packages again. And then we will run the command again in the package manager console. So now I installed the 2 NuGet packages, the SQL server and the tools. And then we will paste in the command to scaffold our dbcontext. So let's run this. And this time it says it's built successfully. And it actually created this master context for us. So if I just zoom out a bit, we can see that we have our table right here, the weather forecasts table. And we have a connection here. And we really don't have to touch this master context file because it's just automatically generated. We have scaffolded it now, so it should be set up as it should. But if we go over to our Solution Explorer, we can see that we now have a data DB folder. And if we expand that, we can see that we have our master context, which is this file. And we also have a weather forecast model. So now we have our date, temperature in Celsius, our summary, and the temperature in Fahrenheit. So what we can do now is to go to pages. And as you can see, because this is a Blazor server app, we have some extra pages included here. We have the host, layout, and error. But we still have our 3 Blazor files from before. So we will just go to the fetch data and let's scroll down. And as you might notice, it's a little bit different here because it's not from a JSON file, but this is actually also hard-coded because if we look in the data folder, we have this weather forecast service where it's getting its data from. So if we look at that one, you can see we have summaries, it's all hard-coded, and we got some dates and temperature, which is just random here. So we don't want to use that now. What we actually want to use is our own database connection. So up here we are saying that we're using the data inside our project, which is this folder, and we don't want to use the weather forecast from that folder. So we have to remove this. And the same with this service, we don't want to inject this service. And instead we actually want to use our own folder. We just scaffolded, so we're saying using, and then the project name, and then we say data db because that's the folder we have scaffolded. And an important thing is also that we want to use Microsoft's entity framework core, because else then we don't have all the functionality to get things from the database. And a final thing is that we want to inject an interface that's called dbcontext factory, and this should take our master context, and then we can give it a name. We could say content factory. So now that we have our not content but context factory, we can scroll down to the code, and then we can say that we want to have a variable called db, which should take the context factory, and let's create a db context. So now we can use this db with link. So let's go and say that our forecasts, this variable, which is an array, but we don't want to have it to be an array, I want to have it to list. So I'll just delete this and remove this one and say list, and it's a list of weather forecasts. And when we do this, we have to say that it should be a new list of weather forecasts. And finally, we can go down and say that the forecast should be equal to db, and then we have our name, which is weather. And I can see it's not coming through, but that's because I forgot to call this method. So now we can say db.weather forecasts, and we say that this should be to a list async, and then we want to await this one. Just like this. And I actually also removed the code that was here at the date, because now we're just going to display the date as it is. So let's try to test this, and let's click fetch data. And as we can see down here, we have another error. An unhandled exception has occurred. We can see the error in the tool. So we hit F12. And inside here we can see that we now have an error message. And it says that there's no registered service of type Microsoft Entity Framework Core. And this interface that we're using. And the reason that this is crashing and it don't work is because if we go out again and we go to the program.cs file, we did not include our context factory to our builder services. So what we're going to do is to say builder.services, and here we actually want to write dbcontext factory, but since it's a part of Entity Framework, we have to say using Microsoft and then use Entity Framework Core. So now we can say db, and we have this add dbcontext factory, and inside that we want to type our master context and then just close it off. And just to keep things clean, we can get rid of this weather forecast service and the data using. So now if we run this again, it should work now. And let's try to click on fetch data. And now it actually gets the data from our own database. And we can see that by the last row here, because that's not what was in the default data that was displayed in the template before. But I think this is a good time to stop, and hopefully I will make a part 2 of this Blazor introduction. Maybe adding some CRUD functionality to this so we can create new weather forecasts, and maybe a search bar so we could search for summary and get all the, let's say, freezing. If we were searching for free in a search bar, then it would just pop up with these. And the powerful thing about Blazor is that you don't have to reload the page to do that, because now C# help us, and the way that Blazor interact with the browser with WebAssembly. So that make it possible for us to make everything on the fly inside the browser without refreshing the page. But I hope you learned something. Please like and subscribe if you liked the video, and else just have a nice day. Bye.